welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something that maybe seems pretty straightforward on the surface. Those functioning labels for autism.
Yeah.
High functioning, low functioning.
Right, we hear them all the time.
But what if they're not neutral, like at all? What if they're tangled up in these really powerful economic and historical forces?
Exactly, and that's our mission for this deep dive. We're pulling from some fascinating expert analysis, academic research too.
Yeah.
And it suggests that something really personal, like a diagnostic label, isn't just about description. It connects to what one source calls the calibration machine.
The calibration machine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's this pervasive system, it argues, that uses labels not just to describe, but to actually assign economic value, to enforce a kind of compliance.
And often totally under the radar, right? Without us realizing it.
Pretty much.
Okay, so get ready for some real aha moments here, because we're going to trace this idea way back.
From its, ancient roots right up to today's corporate world. And hopefully by the end, you'll start to see how these hidden structures influence things.
Not just neurodivergent lives either.
No, how all of us get measured and valued in society today.
Okay, let's unpack this calibration machine idea. The source material starts somewhere pretty surprising historically. It suggests this machine didn't begin with autism.
Really? Where does it take us then?
Well, what's really fascinating is how deep these roots go. The source makes this pretty striking claim. It says the machine did not begin with autism. Its first teeth bit deep into the Highlands.
The Scottish Highlands.
Exactly. It introduces this seanchaidh, a kind of memory keeper for the Gael people who are being hunted and displaced.
Wow.
And this context shows how really early economic shifts, way before autism was a concept, started sorting people based on their perceived economic use.
So this machine was already working, sorting people, before we even had these specific labels. It was changing how communities worked.
Absolutely. The source gives this picture of the Gael people. They used to stitch shoes from stag hide,
Okay.
And it describes this as a relationship, not extraction. Shoes made in an afternoon because, quote, time then was not yet broken into wages.
That's a powerful line.
It is. But then men arrived with maps, with laws literally slicing the land into parcels and the people into labor. Yeah. And that disruption kicked off this huge reframing.
How did that reframing actually, play out? What did that look like?
Well, the shift was pretty stark. The source says subsistence became reframed as idleness, craft as backwardness.
So ways of life became backward.
Yeah. What was once freely made now had to be bought with wages. There's this example. A woman who could make her own shoes in a day. Now she'd have to work for many days to earn enough coin to purchase a pair in a shop. The machine's core demand became really clear.
Which was?
It needed adjustable bodies, pliant bodies, bodies that can be measured, disciplined, corrected.
Right, and if you resisted
this new setup, you were called wild, savage, defective. But if you complied,
you were industrious, modern, civilized.
Precisely.
So this calibration machine, it wasn't just about labels. It was forcing people into a new economic box. And it sounds like the question it asked back then, maybe it's still relevant.
That's exactly the argument. The source connects it directly. It says the fundamental question from this machine then and now is basically, will you tolerate this arrangement?
And the answer determines your label.
Right. If so, you are high functioning. If not, you are low functioning. You are wild. You are unfit. You must be broken. That underlying logic, it argues, just keeps going, even if the targets and the words change.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The source dives into how we measure people today, specifically these adaptive functioning assessments.
Yeah.
How did these modern tests link back to that historical machine?
Well, the connection is that while these tests look neutral, they serve a very specific economic purpose for this calibration machine.
Right.
The machine, as the source puts it, cannot tolerate ambiguity. It must convert lives into data, into units you can compare, sort, assign value to.
And adaptive functioning tests seem like they're just measuring everyday stuff.
On the surface, yes. Hygiene, cooking, managing money, communication skills. Things like that.
So basic life skills. But you're saying, or the source is saying, there's something else going on underneath, a different metric.
Exactly. The true underlying metric, according to this analysis, is the capacity to participate in wage labor.
Okay. So it's not can you cook?
It's not just can you cook. It's whether one can do so at the speed, under the conditions, and within the hierarchical disciplines required by employment.
Wow.
And same for dressing oneself. Not just can you do it, but can you do it quickly, reliably and without disruption in order to appear on time for work.
That's a really powerful distinction. So how does shifting the focus like that from just having a skill to being able to market that skill, how does that change things?
It changes everything. Research cited in the source material consistently shows these evaluations are fundamentally tied to economic outcomes. Think Social Security, disability systems.
Right.
Other researchers even challenge the whole idea of objective work standards. They argue they're actually products of, historical industrial demands, not some universal truth.
Right.
The machine's, quote, genius is masking these economic judgments behind a facade of clinical objectivity. At the end of the day, the question being asked is, can this person be calibrated for efficient extraction?
That's chilling. How these scores that seem so objective can control access to essential resources, all masked as neutral assessment.
And the machine doesn't just assess, it actively recruits.
Yeah.
This leads us to vocational rehabilitation.
Which most people probably see as just support, right?
Right. But the source presents it differently. As an active recruitment and sorting mechanism, it says it functions in practice as a pipeline, a sorting mechanism that disciplines bodies into compliance with the economic order.
A pipeline. Okay. So vocational rehab, maybe seen as supportive, is actually part of this sorting. How does it discipline bodies then?
Well, one really striking example from the source, particularly in the U.S. context, a vocational rehabilitation specialist might be one of the few professionals authorized to provide an official autism diagnosis for adults.
Wait, really? The diagnosis itself is tied to VR?
In some cases, yes, directly tying diagnosis to eligibility for labor force adjustment. The main question isn't about the whole person, it's can this person be made work ready?
So the diagnosis becomes a tool for workforce preparation, not just understanding.
That's the mechanism described. Research shows how these vocational services link up with education, Medicaid, state benefits, forming this seamless network of surveillance and adjustment.
Surveillance even.
That's the term used. And other studies point out that vocational functioning for autistic employees, it's often judged not just on skills, but on things like navigating unspoken social hierarchies, tolerate sensory strain, and regulate affect.
So emotional self-regulation becomes the benchmark.
Exactly. Not necessarily task competence. Other work cited shows success is framed in strictly economic terms. It emphasizes behavioral conformity, emotional control, and social presentation.
The source says the language of support masks the logic of extraction. And to be supported is to be shaped, to be made marketable. What does it mean to smooth the irregularities of embodiment?
It means the machine seeks only to standardize, to smooth out the natural variations in how people exist and experience the world, including neurodivergence, until the body fits neatly into a predetermined economic slot.
Like sanding down the edges to fit a mold.
Kind of turning what might be seen as wildness into controlled, productive units.
Okay, so what's the bigger picture here?
Wow.
The source makes a really strong link from these modern systems back to, well, a pretty uncomfortable part of history. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it raises the question, how new is any of this, really? The source argues that long before the word eugenics was coined, the calibration machine was already sorting bodies.
Already.
Think about early capitalist enclosures. Those historical shifts in land ownership and work, they would recode bodies as deficient if people couldn't be productive in that specific new economic landscape.
So the basic logic, categorizing people, devaluing them based on usefulness that predates modern eugenics.
It seems so. Research highlighted suggests eugenics wasn't just, some abstract scientific idea. It was a social project designed to safeguard economic and political hierarchies.
Okay.
Disability, poverty, neurodivergence. They were pathologized because they disrupted the smooth operation of the industrial state.
And the language changed over time.
Right. Another researcher traces how the rhetoric shifted. Where it once talked about purity, heredity, and degeneration, the modern talk is about productivity, independence, and self-sufficiency.
But the underlying pressure is the same.
That's the argument. The selection pressures remain. Those who can conform to what the source calls neoliberal labor markets, modern capitalism, emphasizing individual responsibility, market forces, they're seen as worthy of support. Those who can't, they're quietly excluded.
And this goes beyond just work, right, into really personal areas.
Absolutely. There's research mentioned that points out how this control extends into the most intimate domains of autonomy, like reproductive policy. So the modern language of adaptive functioning, it serves as the soft face of an ancient discipline. productivity becomes both a moral good and an economic measure.
And managing costs.
Cost containment, yeah. It operates as a proxy for worth. It's not just old history. It's described as the ongoing refinement of the same machinery, recalibrated to operate within neoliberal sensibilities.
So what looks like progress might just be old biases in new clothes.
Okay, this next part's really fascinating. The machine adapts again. Suddenly, we hear about an autism advantage.
Right.
What does that actually mean for people? What's the dynamic there? Well, it's interesting how the calibration machine adjusts its language when, social pressure makes overt exclusion less acceptable. The narrative shifts from deficit to opportunity. And this autism advantage idea emerges. It markets autistic individuals for specific traits.
Like what?
Things like exceptional attention to detail, superior pattern recognition, hyperfocus, and loyalty to routine. That's how some researchers describe it.
So specific traits get cherry-picked and kind of commodified for the job market.
That's exactly the analysis. It's often a selective commodification of specific autistic ways of being, extracted for profit whilst the fuller person remains unacknowledged.
Right.
And other research shows this fits neatly with state interests in managing and optimizing populations for workforce efficiency.
Yeah.
Autistic labor becomes valuable for certain kinds of tasks.
What kind of tasks?
Often those requiring intense, repetitive, often isolating focus, tasks maybe others wouldn't want or couldn't sustain.
So the inclusivity talk becomes a marketing strategy. But what about the money side? Are there financial drivers?
There definitely can be. Research cited documents how corporations can get, quote, significant government subsidies, tax credits, and diversity incentives for hiring disabled workers.
Okay.
But crucially, these benefits are rarely reflected in the workers' wages or working conditions. It's described as a potential double harvest for the corporation.
A double harvest, meaning they get the subsidies and potentially cheaper or more focused labor.
That's the implication. And other work details how certain organizations can act as intermediaries, brokering partnerships between companies and disability communities.
But potentially serving corporate needs more.
Sometimes, yes, potentially marginalizing autistic voices in the process.
The source says, what is sold as empowerment is often enclosure by another name. Makes you really question some of these surface-level inclusivity efforts.
Yeah.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? The story doesn't end with the machine just winning. The sources talk about refusal, resistance.
Absolutely. That's a crucial part of the picture. There are always, as the source puts it, those who refuse to be measured. It emphasizes that the wildness the machine sought to break never truly vanished. It went underground. And autistic people, in particular, are described as being among the most skilled at naming the violence hidden inside the language of compliance.
So this is like an active, conscious pushback against these calibration systems. How does that show up, like, in rejecting labels?
It's a very active reclamation. Research shows autistic individuals overwhelmingly reject functioning labels.
Why? What do they see them as?
They see them as instruments of distortion, labels that describe how tolerable someone is to the system rather than describing their actual needs or experiences.
That makes sense.
So what gets called low functioning might often just be a refusal to mask, to twist yourself into knots, or to sacrifice health for others' comfort.
And there are warnings about severity scales, too.
Yes, warnings that they risk freezing people into fixed hierarchies of worthiness, where the machine's basic question is still just, how expensive is this body to maintain?
It really brings that economic lens back, doesn't it? What about internalizing these labels? What's the impact and what's the alternative proposed?
Well, the source talks about the epistemic violence of taking these labels on board.
Epistemic violence.
Yeah, meaning violence related to knowledge and knowing. So being told you're high functioning while you're actually drowning in unrecognized needs, that's called erasure dressed as compliment.
Wow. Erasure dressed as compliment.
Yeah, and being branded low functioning is like being pre-declared unsalvageable. In either case, your narrative sovereignty, your basic right to tell your own story, is denied.
So what's the alternative vision?
An alternative offered is thinking about autistic development as relational personhood, moving away from this isolated idea of atomized, self-regulating independence.
And
towards growth through collective negotiation of meaning, safety, and shared existence, finding identity and support within a community, basically.
So this refusal, it's not just saying no to labels. It's reclaiming your story, your time, your body, your history. It's insisting on that narrative sovereignty. That feels really powerful.
So, yeah, to kind of pull these threads together, Functioning labels, they're clearly much more than just diagnostic terms.
Mm-hmm.
They function as tools of an economy of compliance that just relentlessly values productivity over actual human thriving. And the true problem, as the source powerfully puts it, was never we who were broken. It was always the machine.
This deep dive has definitely uncovered a lot about those hidden mechanics, how society measures and values us all. It really pushes you to look past the neutral-seeming language, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To question the motives underneath. And that idea that the calibration machine is efficient but may be brittle.
Right. It relies on our consent.
Our consent to its measurements, its stories, its definitions of who's worthy. The more we refuse those terms, the source suggests, the more it fractures.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, maybe it means pushing for something different, building economies of care that do not demand calibration.
Economies of care.
Yeah, ones that honor interdependence, reciprocity, mutual flourishing instead. That could mean things like universal supports not tied to specific diagnoses or thresholds.
Right.
Housing, healthcare without work requirements, education systems that actually cultivate people rather than just manufacturing compliant workers.
So what will you take away from this deep dive? Maybe it's this thought from the source. We were never broken. We have always been wild. And we remember,